Well, the time is upon us. They say it's time for us to get started. I'm Jenny Pluhar with the Texas Grazing Land Coalition. Our session this afternoon is managing the herd beneath the soil, all those little microbes and things and what that can do for us. We have 3 speakers that will be working with us, and I'm going to introduce all of them right now so that we don't have to take time in between each one. So we're going to begin with Jeff Goodwin, who is the program director, he just changed titles, of the Texas A&M Natural Resources Institute. Jeff is going to set the table and talk to us about soil carbon and how some of those relationships work in the soil. We have Anson Howard. Wave your hand, Anson. Anson is an attorney from San Antonio, Texas. Anson is also a ranch owner. He owns Head of the River Ranch near Cristoval, Texas, which is a really cool property. It is literally where the Concho River bubbles out of the ground in West Texas. Pretty neat stuff. And we're going to hear from Dr. Hank Mouvier from Grassroots Carbon. Hank's a really smart guy that knows all kinds of things about all this stuff and is going to wow us with lots of knowledge. So I'm going to let them take it from here. Hopefully we'll have time for some questions at the end. Do you guys want questions during your presentations? Anson says no. Okay, what's your rule? Oh, I forgot. Anson's a Marine. And I have a Marine at my house too. You can tell him your rule.
Hold all questions till the end. They'll probably be answered during the briefing.
Yes, I forgot about that. We're under military rules today in here. Anyway, I'm going to turn it over to them, and hopefully we'll have some time for some questions at the end.
Thanks, Jenny. Good afternoon, everyone. Jeff Goodwin. As Jenny announced there, they asked me to come in and kind of set the stage, and they're gonna have some really good information about the practicality of what some of these ecosystem service markets are. What are the opportunities for people, particularly landowners, private landowners within Texas and the surrounding states. We thought we might just start off on a brief conversation about what are ecosystem services, why do they matter to me and my ranch. And so when we start conversations like this, I like to look at landscapes like this and ask people, what do you see, right? And 9 times out of 10, I see cows or black cows and grass, right? Well, when we start to think of ourselves as part of an ecosystem and part of a property, we begin to understand that there's dynamic ecological systems happening, multiple cycles, and they're all happening, competing for balance, right? And so what are we talking about when we start talking about these systems? And so from that perspective, we're really talking about the 4 primary ecosystem processes. So the water cycle, the nutrient cycle, the energy cycle, and plant community dynamics. And we all know that when we look at landscapes like this and we see all of these grass blades, right? Those are basically little solar panels, and they're converting the power of the sun's energy into basically through these processes to a productive piece of protein that we can consume. And so really understanding how these cycles are working and functioning within either a rangeland or a pasture or a cropland system, that's our job as landowners and managers, is to really figure out how, when we want to implement a practice, how is it going to implement the energy cycle? How are we going to impact that water cycle? What are the outcomes, these driven pieces that make that cycle function? And so when we start to move forward in that process, that's when we truly start to begin to understand the impact of what we do on a landscape. And so as we begin to apply that management, those outcomes are services, right? And so that's what we mean when we talk about ecosystem services. They're the many and varied benefits to us, to humans, provided by the natural environment and from healthy ecosystems. And so when we think about that, most people don't think about food and fiber, but that's an ecosystem service that has been provided producers have been providing for thousands of years, right? But that's the only one we've been paid for, right? So we also produce increased water quality, water quantity, biodiversity, pollination, climate regulation, and most specifically what we'll talk a little bit about today is carbon sequestration. So all of those are ecosystem services that are provided by you as landowners to a growing urban public. So from our perspective today, we'll hone in a little bit on the carbon piece. Soils drive the system. On any terrestrial agricultural enterprise, the health and function of your soil will often delineate or determine whether or not you're going to be a functioning agricultural enterprise. I love the book by Dr. David Montgomery. It's a book called Dirt, and he talks about the fall of civilizations from the Mayans to the Romans, all these civilizations that fell because they overutilized the soil resource. When we start to begin to understand the complexities of how that soil is working with our plant communities and then how we interact with those plant communities, we start to begin to understand the larger system. We haven't treated our soils very well. We all know the impacts of the Dust Bowl and the negative impacts that were had on our soils in the 1930s. The problem is this picture wasn't taken in the 1930s. It was taken a couple of years ago in North Texas. So these things are still happening, right? We're still having impacts on our soils that we as managers can work around and do a better job. As we start to look at the complexity of the impacts of our soils from a global perspective, a few years ago, the foundation or the Food and Ag organization, the FAO, did a status of the world's soil resources. And they found one of their overarching conclusions was, the overwhelming conclusion from the report was that the majority of the soil's resources were fair, poor, or very poor condition. That should scare most of us. Even more scary is this quote from the report. Humanity loses another 0.3% of our global food production capacity each year to soil erosion and degradation. How many of you have driven down the road and seen a field where the topsoil is either being blown off onto the road, you're blown out into the ditch, we're losing topsoil at an alarming rate. And that should impact every person in this room. If we look at soil carbon distribution, those losses from a global perspective, we've got a little histogram here developed by Dr. Sanderman where we start to see the changes in SOC, soil organic carbon, across all these countries. Basically, you don't want to see yellow and red. And I see a lot of yellow and red, right? And so we have an opportunity here to employ practices and principles to regenerate these landscapes. So how do we fix it? Let's start with what we know, and we know that soil health matters. Can we all agree on that, right? We all agree that healthy soils lead us to a healthy economic system. We also kind of know, and we're pretty good at understanding the physical characteristics of soil, right? So we understand, we've written books on soil texture, soil particle size, bulk density, pore space. We've mapped them. We've written soil surveys about these chemical and our physical characteristics. We're pretty good at that. We're also pretty good at the chemical side, right? So we understand how to take the pH of our soils. We understand that phosphorus, nitrogen, and potassium in whatever form are driving a lot of the functionality in these systems. So from a chemical perspective, we can go out and we can take a soil test and we can measure all of these primary macro and micronutrients. How about the soil biology? Do we know that as well as we know the chemical and physical characteristics? I would argue that we do not. I think it's one of the new frontiers in agriculture. The more we understand about the biological interactions between soil microbiology and plants, and I think we ultimately will understand that the health of that soil works through the health of the animal, and the health of that animal leads to a healthy human. And so there is some linkages between healthy land, healthy livestock, and healthy people. And I think we're learning more and more about that every day. But when we start to think about the actual amount of biomass in a healthy, functional prairie ecosystem, here's just one example here. When we're looking at total microbial fungi, these are terms of pounds per acre in a 6-inch slice of 1 acre. So we're adding up all of the fungi, the bacteria, the algae, the earthworms, nematodes, all of them. You start to add those up from a biomass perspective, and that's about 27,000 pounds of biology per acre. So when we say that we want to manage the underground herd, we're literally talking about 22 animal units per acre if you were to take that and convert that into a 1,200-pound cow. Okay, so that's a pretty heavy stock density. But it's all under the ground, and we don't think about it because when was the last time, and until you sort of wanted to start learning about these, when was the last time you went out to the pasture and dug a hole? You were probably building a fence, right? That was me. And so now we begin to understand some of these complexities and appreciate them a lot more. And so when we start to think about that biology is, and when I say biology, I'm talking about all of these microorganisms in the soil. What's their food source? They're primarily made of nitrogen and carbon, right? And so they utilize another carbon source in the soil. They'll use exudates from live plants. And so they're building these relationships with plants, right? And so as they die, their nitrogen becomes more available in the whole nitrogen system. But they're working with symbiotic relationships. Mycorrhizal fungi, for instance, develop symbiotic relationships with plants where they essentially extend their root systems to where the fungi bring water and phosphorus and key nutrients to that plant and for exchange for some carbon through those exudates being leaked out. But the primary fuel source is carbon. Where is the carbon on the planet? Anybody know? Most of the time when we start talking about carbon, the first thing someone says is, well, are you talking about CO2? Okay, that's part of the carbon cycle. Where is it? So I like this slide from FAO. When we start to think about where is the carbon on the planet, there's about 750 petagrams or billion tons. There's 750 billion tons of carbon in the terrestrial biomass on the planet. So that's the Amazon rainforest, the boreal forest, the grasslands, all of the terrestrial plants. In the atmosphere, there's about 750 in the atmosphere. There's about 580 in the terrestrial plants. All right. So if you combine those, that's still less than the amount of soil carbon that's in the top 3 feet on the Earth's crust. So there's more soil carbon in the top 3 feet of the Earth's crust than there is in the atmosphere and all of the terrestrial biomass combined. Where do we have our greatest impact from an agricultural production perspective? On the top 3 feet of the planet, right? So that's where we make our impact. That's where most of the soil carbon is comparatively. We're not talking about the oceans. That's a whole nother ball of wax. But from the terrestrial landscape, there's a tremendous amount in our soils, and our soils are the driving force. So why should a growing urban public care? Why should they care about soil organic carbon on some ranch that they've never been on, right? I'm not sure, but they do. We start to look at claims all around the world, from Spain to Canada, Tasmania, looking for beef producers to tackle the climate crisis with positive carbon farming. And so why are they talking about this? So from a carbon perspective, we have to get back and talk a little bit about greenhouse gases. And so when we start to look at some of this data, this is some of the most recent data from EPA, and what we're seeing is the total U.S. greenhouse gas emissions in 2019 by sector. And so we've got transportation at 29%, electricity, industry, and agriculture right here. Rightly so, we are a contributor, right at about 10%. We get 90% of the blame, but we're about we have about a 10% fractional distribution. If you were to take out all of that, and let's just look at sort of what is the breakdown of how those gases are brought up. So the three primary ones are carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide. Certainly the elephant in the room is carbon dioxide. And so from a climate perspective, from an urban or an industry perspective, they're interested in soil organic carbon to offset this, right? And so if we dig a little bit deeper and we take that 10% slice and we break it down into the Y, we begin to look at the graphic. Here's the metric tons of CO2 equivalent, on the left. And so when we start to look at how these break down, this is some data from 1990 through 2019. When we start to look at the partition of how much, which segments in agriculture are making up that 10%. This red here is enteric fermentation of methane in cattle operations. We're not going to change a whole lot of that. We're still going to have cows. We got less cows now than we had bison 200 years ago. What's creating twice of that impact is agricultural soil management. So all of that blue is how we're managing the landscape, how we're managing tillage primarily. So it's a big issue. It's a concern, even a concern for most current companies. Many of them have expressed a goal of net zero or even carbon neutral by 2040 or 2050. So a lot of these people, or a lot of these organizations and institutions are interested in their supply chain. Where's their supply chain start? With us. So that's where the opportunity begins to come. The answer is literally staring at us. Our opportunity to work and quantify and subsequently value the ecosystem services that we've provided through our farming and ranching opportunities. Here's just a little bit of data adapted from Dr. Chessman in 2017, looking at the private lands, working lands of the U.S. Approximately 2.3 billion acres, total land acres. 56% of those are our working lands, broken out this way. If we were to increase the soil organic carbon by 6 inches, only by a half inch, a half of a percent of organic matter. So the top 6 inches, if we were able to increase that by 0.5% organic matter, that would roughly capture 6 billion tons of carbon, about 60% of our annual carbon emissions. So there is some opportunity for us to move the needle here, but we're all going to have to be playing on the same playing field. We do that through land stewardship. Land stewardship's implementing a suite of these practices based on ecological principles. It's not grazing for grazing's sake. It's using cattle as a tool to positively impact ecosystems. We increase producer livelihoods also, as well as public benefit. We're here to provide better solutions. That's what we have to do. We come together as producers and figure out what is our best task ahead, because the private landowner in this situation is the key. And if the private landowner's not at the table, then this thing is going to work. It'll be a wreck from the beginning. Aldo Leopold said it very well in 1934 when he said conservation will ultimately boil down to rewarding the private landowner who conserves the public interest. That was said almost 100 years ago, or 90 years ago, and he could have been saying that at this conference today. It's time to change the paradigm of ecosystem services and pay producers for what they're producing. With that, I will hand it over to these smart young men right here. I guess.
Left. Awesome. Thanks, Chef. All right. Afternoon. I'm Anson Howard. As Jenny said, I was a Marine. I'm an attorney that represents landowners for all issues concerning real property. And most importantly, I'm a regenerative rancher, father, and husband. So I'm going to focus on giving you all perspective from two of those positions today. One is the regenerative rancher for soil carbon storage. Two is an attorney that's represented myself and other landowners for negotiating these agreements. All right. So Jeff talked about the ecosystem services. Anybody that's practicing regenerative grazing is adding to these ecosystem services. The idea is, how do you actually get paid? One, how do you quantify? Two, how do you get paid for doing the things that you've been doing? Jeff had listed a bunch of ecosystem services. These are a few, sort of the simple, and certainly by no means all of them, but air, water, wildlife, vistas, soil carbon storage. Right now, the only ones that are really being paid for, and Jeff can correct me if I'm wrong, but wildlife, that's probably the original one, getting paid for hunting. Vistas, really the way to get paid for that is a conservation easement, so if you can sell a conservation easement. And then 3, soil carbon storage. This is the newest and neatest. We've heard about carbon for forever. It's come and gone. It's real now. That's why Hank's here. Grassroots carbon is actually now paying landowners in the state of Texas for their regenerative grazing practices. There are a bunch of other ecosystem services groups that are coming on that are starting to do measurement for soil carbon storage. Lots of opportunities, and very exciting to finally be, for the rancher, from my perspective, to really be able to realize value from the practices that we've been doing all along, because they're the right thing for the soil, for the land, and for the livestock. All right, a little bit about our operation. So I'm going to talk briefly about where we are, what we've done in order to be eligible for soil carbon storage and to participate in the grassroots program. And then I'm going to talk about the grassroots contract or ecosystem services contract in general. So my family ranches over here in Christoval, Texas. We've primarily 3 different ecosystems, ecoregions. We've got the head springs of the South Concho River, so we have riparian forest bottomland. We've got the mesquite, live oak, prickly pear flats, and then we've got cedar, live oak, limestone hills. The land history, just like almost anybody else that's had a piece of property, it settled by, in this case, white man back in the 1870s. My family got it in 1902. It was overgrazed because that's just how it was done back then. You're trying to make a living from it. Then grandfather had it. It was better. He was exposed to savory. He started rotation, but it's still, the land was probably being overutilized. The ranch was leased from 1998 to 2018. I came back in 2018 with the support of my family, took back over the ranch, took over the lease with the specific intent of practicing regenerative grazing. I'm stuck practicing law during the week in San Antonio, hired a great ranch manager that is daily executing that, making the moves, dealing with all the fun that comes of it. So that was the ranch as it existed in 2018, 11 primary pastures ranging in size from 600 to 1,800 acres. The issue with that when we took over, as we found, is that that number of pastures, trying to do rotational grazing, you're actually going backwards because our rest period wasn't long enough. So 2 most important things is you got to have intensity and then long enough rest for it to cover. There's no set period, you're just not coming back until it's fully recovered. So as I said, when we took over, we start with the end in mind. End result was we've got the head springs of the South Concho River. We are going to do everything possible to keep those flowing. How are we going to do that? We're going to use multi-species grazing. Right now we've got the cattle. We just started on the sheep. Goats are yet to, hopefully they're coming 2022. The reason, so we've used fire, we've used mechanical, we've used chemical. I have yet to find any that are as effective as the cattle. As you all know, it's very tempting to go in and mechanically clear. It's very tempting to spray. Using ruminants to graze it is far and away the best solution we found, because as long as you don't overgraze, there are very little unintended consequences. We cleared mechanically. Great, you come back 50 years later, we have prickly pear spread all over the ranch because we cleared mechanically. You spray. Now you have all those chemicals, as you know, in the soil. There are unintended consequences from that. Using the ruminants has been phenomenal. Goal being to establish a mid-level to tall grass ecosystem. This is Dad looking at one little blue stem plant back in 2018. Cool thing is, guess what? There's some pictures now. We've got a lot more than one. So yeah, there's the river. It's flowing. So the river starts right here with the head springs that's coming up out of the ground, and then the springs flow down. Complete disclaimer, this was this was fall of 2018, so this was record-setting year, but it does flow from that point annually, and we've seen better flows through our management. All right, so 2019, that's what the ranch looked like. We took over, as we said, with even a rotational grazing system that we tried. We got some slides. We were actually going backwards. So we put in, I'm going pretty fast over this. If y'all are here at this conference, that means that you know something about regenerative grazing, you know about electric fencing. We can skip over that, but essentially we installed over 20 miles of water lines and 40 miles of cleared lanes and for electric fencing, and took what was 11 pastures to 217 paddocks, extending our rest to approximately 260 days. Still not there. We need to be at 500 days. So we're working on getting our paddocks smaller. Just got off the phone with my manager. We're moving back into there on Friday, and he told me he's going to make 4 moves. So we are extending our rest. All right, water, plow in the water line, plow in 3-inch poly pipe, have a solar. Fortunately, RPG produces 30 gallons a minute now. Solar, 1 permanent water trough per pasture. Portable water trough, thanks to Understanding Ag, Alan Williams and Alejandro Carrillo. All right, fencing, single strand poly high tensile, dividing each pasture rectangularly, and then we come off that with our poly wire. Can't do any of this without adapted genetics. We use farrow. That's just what we're starting with. We're only in year 3, so we will continue to adapt. Farrow's been great for us, but it's finding cattle that work for you. All right, so yes, we did. Now we are actually finishing. So these are our keeper heifers, but we're finishing them out all the way. But only about 100 acres is under pivot. All right, so results, took what was previously, turned into prickly pear and grazed it down, got the vegetation in contact with the soil, and instead of just being a winter, Alan Williams, everybody talks a lot about not having monocultures. So what was a winter grass monoculture is now coming back in vine mesquite, lots of other different species. How do you get paid for all this? It's doing the data collection up front. Yours truly took photo points, didn't do transects. Wish I'd done photo points are great. And looking at how the level of vegetation. I guess at the time I just didn't get around to imagining that we could ever change the grass species that much. So I wish now I'm ready to come back in and start doing transects because we're seeing so many new cool grasses pop up. Another one of the results, so this was all just bare ground and rocks 2 years ago. You can barely see the rocks through there. This is all little blue stem now. So top picture, this was January, so almost a year ago, area right along the river. And granted, we grazed it, took half, and then there was a flood on top of it. So it was, by the time the flood came over, there wasn't as much, but you stay off of it, and 6 months later, it looks like that. And we're seeing that all along the riparian area. Biggest thing, none of this is possible, as Jeff talked about, unless you get the soil health back because of the chemical. So we talked about not using chemicals, not just spraying them on the land, also not putting them into the animals. So because we are no longer ivermecting, worming our livestock, we've got dung beetles back, and they are hard at work every day, breaking down that manure, fertilizing the soil with it, and also opening up the soil. All right, the important part, how do we get y'all paid? So looking at it, we've got the soil carbon storage right now. It's the new biggest opportunity. I think most people figured out the hunting leases. Soil carbon storage, what it is there are 4 players in it. There's the purchaser, who's your Google, Marathon, all those folks that Jeff just had up on the board that say, hey, we want to be carbon neutral. Problem is, our business has a huge carbon footprint that we can't get rid of. Enter Hink, Grassroots Carbon, the broker that says, cool, carbon emitter, we're going to connect you with a landowner that's doing regenerative grazing practices that are pulling that carbon out of the atmosphere because of their the species composition that they've created on their property, sticking that carbon anywhere from 3 inches to 3 feet down in the soil, storing it there. And so Grassroots connects landowner with the purchaser. The 4th player in this is the verifier, which is an independent third party that verifies and says, landowner, they come out, they do the measurements and say, landowner they quantify how much soil carbon the landowner stored in the soil per acre per year. Grassroots right now is brokered contracts that this past year, they were $16.50 an acre, right? $16.50 an acre? Per metric ton per acre. This coming year, they're already up to $23 per metric ton sequestered carbon. So it's a booming opportunity business right now. Getting into the contracts a little bit in terms of how you're paid. So looking at it from the landowner's perspective, you're connected with Grassroots Carbon. All the landowner has to agree to do, sign a contract. Let's go on to all right, so contract terms. It's a 10-page contract. By legal standards, it's pretty short. And really at the end of the day, the number one thing I'm going to remind everybody of is you're in a partnership, like with any contract, in this case with Grassroots Carbon. So you need to trust your partner. There are a lot of ecosystem services groups out there. There's some that are sort of hedge fund private equity backed that have a crazy Excel spreadsheet model, and they're looking to basically package something up that's not real and sell it, and doubtful the landowner gets paid on that model, doubtful that there's actually any value created. It works for their model briefly. That is not at all what I've seen with the grasslands groups in Texas. They're all producer oriented, that are 100% focused on helping the producer get paid for what they're creating. So contract, in this case with Grassroots, it was 15-year contract. The time you've got on it is you've got 5 years, period in which the carbon's being sold, and then the landowner commits not to destroy that carbon for a period of 10 years. So 5-year contract, from year 5, you commit for an extra 10 years, so 15-year total contract. From an attorney perspective, that's very doable. You think about contracts, all right, maybe 15 years sounds long, but if you look at how long most of these properties have been owned, that's reasonable. You can also, all right, what if I want to put a solar farm on the property? What if I want to go in and grub portions of the property? You name it, land practices that disturbs the carbon. As long as you're not actually coming down into the soil and disturbing it, sort of sod busting, you're probably pretty safe that you're going to actually destroy any of the carbon. For example, you can still run prescribed burns across it. The issue comes like want to put a solar farm on it. The way around that is just exclude that acreage, or the contract's also pretty flexible that if there's a land change, you can potentially work on trading some acreage and paying back the acreage you've pulled out. Don't recommend that. Plan ahead. Just exclude the acreage that you don't intend to, or that you intend to do something with. How is this compatible with oil and gas development, wind farms? Which sort of goes. The IRS has a very undefined, unvalidated rule, which is don't disturb more than 2% of the surface on any given property. That's part of conservation easement as well. So as long as you keep your oil and gas development and your wind farm development using best practices and as limited as possible, you're not going to run into an issue there. The next, probably biggest part, all right, payment. So we've got a 15-year contract. Payment terms are Grassroots Carbon is the broker. Well, the purchaser is going to pay now $23 per metric ton of carbon sequestered on that property. Grassroots, the broker's cut of that's 80%, but that's 80% of the net. What are your expenses? The expenses in year one with the initial measurements, so how they measure. So 8,600 acres, they came in and did 123 different points across the ranch that sort of, according to the mapping, got a good representation of the property. So I think that's about an average of a measuring location to every 65, 70 acres. The way they measure it, take a little side by side, stick a machine on the back that takes the soil sample 3 feet down, ship that off to laboratory, analyze it. They also have a vegetation monitoring crew that comes out on the property, looks at everything going on the property, looks at the vegetation. Based on that, they estimate how much carbon the landowner is going to store, they think, per acre per year. So costs, right? He will speak more about that, but what the landowner figured out is getting paid $16.50, I think it was $9 per acre for the first year, was that estimated measurement cost. So $9 for the estimated measurement cost. So the first year the landowner, only getting paid $16.50 per metric ton, wasn't getting paid a whole lot. But starting in year two, the measurement costs are just a $1 per acre verification fee. So that drops you down to $15.50. Then you take the grassroots 80%, 20% off of it, and the landowner was getting 20%. So no, Hink's over here going, man, my numbers are looking great. But no, the broker's getting 20%, and so the landowner was averaging $12 per acre per year. Now going forward, that's going to be $17 when you're selling the carbon for $23 per metric ton. In terms of payment, the great thing is landowners got no out-of-pocket cost. So for example, there are other ranches that are getting paid. Our ranch, they haven't finished the verification process, so we're not getting paid, but I'm not worried because we're not out of pocket anything. That's the way I look at it is we were paying to do these, to do this soil carbon storage or soil measurements on our own, and now we've got Hink's team coming in and doing it for it. Also, you get pasture map for free, so there's some benefit there. Landowner obligations, as I was talking about, that's really just don't destroy your soil. Don't sod bust it. You can still grub limited areas, and you can, as I said, run fire, and obviously high intensity, low frequency grazing is encouraged. Other legal considerations from the landowner's perspective, or you want to reserve the right to audit. Obviously, you're trusting that the broker and that the verifier are accurately measuring your soil carbon storage, selling it, and that they're not somehow taking some unknown cut of it. So you just put in a simple right to audit provision. One thing that's in terms of right to data, a lot of landowners are very private. I've seen this a lot with farmers that I've represented, is they really want to keep that data. I think farming side's much more data driven, and there's a lot more trade secrets. If how much fertilizer am I going to put on? How many other inputs am I going to put to get a certain yield in return? You can write that data protection into the agreements. It's got it. Personally, from putting on my landowner hat now, I'm not at all worried about that. I mean, you wanted to see how much carbon storage I've got. You want to know how many head I'm running. How much I spent to be able to do this. It was $90 per acre. I've got a slide on it. So I'm not, there's nothing that I see that you need to hide, but yeah, right to data, you can absolutely contract around that. Most important thing, you're letting somebody else on your property to come in and measure and do these vegetation samplings. So you need an insurance and indemnity provision. As I said, probably at the end of the day, most important consideration is who your business partner is. I've had a phenomenal experience with grassroots carbon. Somebody else just might not get along as well with ink. So there are other folks out there in the market, and you should absolutely, as with any contract, you should always look at all your options. Talked about the measuring. All right, photo points. This is what I was using as a gauge for how we were doing. It was interesting. So I started taking the photo points May 2017. That was when the ranch was leased under a continuous grazing program. It had been good. It was, say, the ranch was understocked and underutilized, and you could see this in some places. July 2019, that's when we first took over after a great year of rain. And then, oh my gosh, what happened? We started doing high intensity with not enough low frequency. So we came back over it probably once too many times without a recovering rain. But you know what? This is what it looks like now. And what's neat is, yeah, sure, it's still not quite to the degree of what you see in the exclusion, but if you can see, that's a much darker vegetation. That's all winter grass. And this is a mix of buffalo grass, winter grass, and other species. So we're getting some neat different species in here. Also, guess what? We're not coming back and grazing it until it's actually fully recovered. So it's a snapshot in time, and this pasture is still 700 acres. It's not going to be cut up until this next graze. So that is the quick overview of what we've done. And with that, we've got time for Hink's presentation and then questions.
Cool. I want to start with an apology for my Northwest Texas accent, but I'm sure that by the end of this half hour you get used to it. I was actually asked to talk about the carbon market and explain how a carbon market works, actually make it easier for you. And it's actually pretty simple. I don't need slides for that. I'm actually done in probably 30 seconds. Sell me your carbon, just trust me. That's also what Anson said, and you have a very good deal. That's it. Any questions before we're done? It's actually that simple. Of course it isn't. What I want to do in the coming 30 minutes is basically go to a couple of things. How does a carbon market work? What might be important for landowners? What is kind of a checklist of things you need to consider before you sign any contract? And the last thing, what is grassroots carbon offering? But be aware, that's my sales pitch. So use the checklist and see if I sell you anything which is valuable to you. So let's start with the first thing. How does a carbon market work? So it starts with companies and organizations who are under tremendous pressure to lower their carbon footprint. And what is a carbon footprint? That is basically a word describing what is the total CO2 emissions from a company or an organization. And the pressure comes from every direction, from customers, from investors, from governments, environmental groups, all over the place. Especially in Europe, you see that a lot, but it starts to happening in the United States as well. Companies are very, very aware of this risk, and it comes from every direction. The cool thing is that they have a problem, but you guys have a solution. And it's a solution not very well recognized, but they start to understand that you have a very powerful solution there. So what is it? Let's go back to a little bit of science. It starts, of course, with photosynthesis, the nature's powerful technology that drives your business. You live from photosynthesis. Atmospheric carbon, together with water, in the green parts of a plant, with solar energy, you capture that into sugars and oxygen. And the sugars, of course, are growing your plant. It's the biomass. But as we saw in previous presentations, and also Alan Williams explaining next door, a large part of these sugars are pumped into the root systems, into the soil, into the microorganisms. And the microorganisms give nutrients back to the plants. That's what we're talking about, soil carbon. So we're not necessarily talking about roots. or the plant biomass, we're talking about carbon, sugars, and other forms of carbon into the soil. Another picture. So your property, if you have healthy soils, because that's important, you store atmospheric carbon into your soil using solar energy and rain. They have a problem. So they emit carbon. So think about if they emit a ton of CO2 at 2,200 pounds, and you store a ton of CO2 extra, it means that the net carbon emission is actually 0. So you can actually say you store their carbon. Okay, that's kind of cool. So if you can give them a certificate with a stamp on it that it's really proven and backed up by science and measured, they're willing to pay you for that. For instance, $20 per ton. That's kind of cool. So keep in mind that healthy soils, depending on where you are and how much rainfall you have, because rainfall is important, you can store over 4, maybe 5 or 6 tons of CO2 per acre per year. There are properties in Mississippi where they store 12 tons of CO2 per acre per year. Look at the price. It starts to become very interesting. Yeah? Cool. So this is basically the market. You store carbon, so you offer a carbon storage footprint reduction service. Nobody's going to touch your carbon, but you give the guarantee that you actually store it. And these guys have a demand for carbon footprint reduction. So if you give them credits, they pay you and they store your carbon. Cool. So let's look at the market. Now it becomes more complicated. In the United States, we're in a situation that we have a voluntary market. So the market is not forced by law. You don't have to do anything yet in the US about carbon reduction. In Europe, that's a whole different story. So a buyer and a seller can agree on price and terms and conditions. So if a rancher stores carbon, the company might pay them. It's that simple. I don't want to go in much more detail, but it can also be a regulatory market. That's not the case yet in the US, but everybody expects that over time you might move to a regulatory market. Nobody knows how long that will take, depends on elections and things like that. But it can be a carbon tax, that companies are being taxed for every ton of CO2. So if they're being taxed, let's say $40, it becomes very interesting to actually store that carbon for $30. They save $10. Or it can be a cap and trade, that they're only allowed to emit so much, and if they do more, they have to buy credits. So let's not go in details, because it's not there yet. So back to this market. So let's first look at demand, because if there's no demand, there's no market, so you can't get paid. So again, it goes back to this tremendous pressure. There's almost not a single company in the US anymore who feels this pressure. Even companies who were actively talking about climate change, which was not true, or creating confusion, they're all looking into this type of stuff. They have to. So companies have a lot of choices. You're not the only solution. Complicated picture. If I want to reduce my carbon footprint, I can go for lower carbon emissions. And that's for most companies the best way of doing it. They can go to renewable energy, wind and solar. They go for energy efficiency, all that type of stuff. So that's what they should do in the first place. Then they can buy offsets. An offset is a weird thing. It's also a carbon credit. You pay someone else to reduce their carbon footprint. So that's kind of weird. If I build a wind turbine, people can pay me for the CO2 emissions I save. That's kind of strange how that works. It can even be more weird. If I have a tree or a forest, you can pay me so I won't chop down that tree. That's almost a kind of carbon hostage situation. That happens with a lot of the jungle in the Amazon. You pay these folks to preserve the Amazon. That's actually not reducing atmospheric carbon, it's actually making it not worse. Then there is technology solutions. Very popular, of course, by the energy industry, because that's the language they understand. They understand pipelines and compressors and steel. So very expensive, CCS, carbon capture and sequestration, where you pump CO2 in reservoirs. It's very well known. ExxonMobil talks about it with very big numbers. $100 billion of investment they're wanting to make. $100 billion. There's direct air capture, all these type of technologies, and it's very fancy. Companies like that. Then there is nature-based stuff. Forestry, very well known. If you plant a tree, you start storing atmospheric carbon. Very well known. Way less known, soil carbon, because you don't see it so easily, but it's right on your feet. The capacity from soil carbon is much larger than forestry, and it's also way more resilient. It's fire resilient. We have a couple of our customers who lost basically all their carbon storage in forest because of the forest fires in California and Oregon last year. So soil carbon, much more resilient. So look at these numbers here. The US has about 6.6 billion tons of CO2 per year. Globally, it's about 50 billion tons. Companies pump enormous amounts of money into these technology type of solutions because that's what they trust. And forestry, they know that. Look at the number there. In 2040, they talk about 1.5 billion tons of CO2 per year in CCS, carbon capture sequestration, and the value is $100 billion. Wouldn't it be cool if some of that money would go to real regenerative solutions, which really change ecology, has impact on water, birds, insects, wildlife, all these other good things, way more impactful than just some steel machines who do the job for you? That's basically what we try to do. So how can we take a huge chunk of that enormous investment and move it into actually folks who make real change? Some companies understand what's going on. Look at this gentleman, Ben van Beurden, CEO of Shell. Shell will use nature in 2030 already for 120 million tons per year. That's forestry, it's wetlands, it's soil, and the projects need to be high quality, independently verified. So that's 8 years from now. Shell is looking all over the place to get projects. 120 million is a lot. That's only Shell, and there's way more companies out there, of course. So demand is not a problem. It will grow like crazy. How about the supply? Well, you've heard actually from Jeff, it's all about how you manage plants. Healthy vegetation leads to healthy soil, leads to abundant microbes, and that leads to soil carbon storage. So how you manage plants is really important. 90% of the soil function is delivered by microbes. Microbes depend on plants. So how you manage plants is critical. And how you manage plants is actually by your cattle as part of it, and how you schedule your ranching. I'm not going a lot of detail here because Jeff knows way more about it, and Alan Williams on the other side of the wall. But basically, if you do conventional grazing and overgrazing, you might lose carbon. So you'll lose actually carbon. If you move to a situation of adaptive grazing, of regenerative grazing, everything is changing. Deep root systems, water infiltration, soil carbon, and you might store a lot of carbon. So that's of course where we need to be if you want to have a lot of credits. Okay, so you can supply. The only thing to make this market work is a price. Is the price high enough? Let's look. Well, if you look at Europe, which is a few years ahead of the US potentially, in May, when I gave this presentation before, it was $60 per ton of CO2. Last month, it was already $80 per ton of CO2. Things go up crazy. That's of course because of the COP26 in Glasgow. What you can safely say for the US is that the CO2 price will go up. We experienced that. Anson showed our contracts with buyers was $16.50 per ton CO2 last year. We're now at 23. And we have longer term contracts with higher prices going up. It's safe to say that in 8 years from now, we're probably over $40 per ton, and maybe much higher. Of course, I don't have a crystal ball, and you must also be very careful. Soil is not the only solution. You're competing basically with technology solutions. And I've had discussions with dozens and dozens of very large companies, and some of them say, yeah, that sounds so cool, the soil, but biology is very fragile. We trust pipelines and compressors way more. It's just their mindset. They're trained and engineers to think in steel and compressors and think they can control everything that way. And have kind of a natural fear for natural systems, which of course are way more robust than human engineered systems. So that takes sometimes a lot of explanation, but also keep in mind, you cannot just charge any price you want. They have alternatives. Cool. There's a supply, there's a demand, there's a price, so this market can go, and that's actually what you get. You get a kind of a carbon Wild West, and you read in the newspapers about that there is brokers and carbon storage companies pop up all over the place. So how do you trust them? There's of course skepticism and concerns. From the landowner side, do you get a fair deal? Who's getting the profit here? When will they pay me? Will they pay me at all? Who will take over my ranch? Do I lose my freedom? So maybe it's better to wait till this market is established. Logical set of reasoning from the landowner. On the carbon storage buyer, you get the same story there. How can I be sure that the carbon is stored? Why is it so expensive? Why do I need to pay a landowner $20 per ton? Why would I do that? Why should I trust this? How long will they store carbon? Because these guys might plow their field and I'll lose everything. So maybe it's better to wait. So that's how the market is not working, of course. If you do it in this way, it means that the money will flow to all the technology solutions because people don't trust soil carbon yet. So that's the consequence. And you miss out on these tremendous deals on real value. So waiting has its price. But hey, there are many standards describing how you measure soil carbon, how to turn it into credits. So which one is best for you? There's many brokers, and we're one of them, but there are many ones. Which one is best for you? And of course, you need to find the right fit. So that will bring me to my second part of the presentation. What might be important for landowners? And it's basically a short checklist. It's about your freedom, it's about payments, it's about robustness, and very important about your risks. So let's go over these things very quickly. What practices and changes are accepted during the contract? And Anson talked a little bit about it. Can you build a solar farm? Can you put wind turbines there? Or are they actually putting me into a tight frame where I have to rotate my cattle so many times per day? That's important to know that, of course. What are my commitments after the contract ends and for how long? Some contracts are for 100 years or for 30 years. I would have a hard time for my family to sign a contract for 30 years. Yeah? Who will develop a carbon plan for the farm? Is there a carbon plan? Is there certain rules I have to follow? And the last thing, who signs the contract in case of landlord-tenant relationships? Payments. Are there upfront or continuing costs to pay? Do you have to pay to participate here? How much and when will I be paid? Do I get a fair share? Anson missed this up, the 80-20%. So we charge a 20% broker fee and the 80% will go to the landowner. We'll explain it a little bit later. Payments by acre or by the amount of carbon stored. If you do an exceptional job and you store a lot of carbon, do you get more money? How will an increase in carbon price be incorporated? Do you have a fixed price for 10 years? I would advise you to not ever do that because the price will go up on a yearly basis. Yeah? What cut does the scheme owner take? What is the length of the contract? How is the soil carbon being determined? Some brokers, they fly over your property with a satellite and they give you a number. Yeah, that might be good, but there's also a lot of criticism there. So how is it being determined? How is it certified? Are there actually buyers on the contract? Maybe some brokers try to sign up as many landowners as possible in the hope that they get the buyers. So maybe you never get paid. Yeah? And what is the broker's experience? How long are they doing that? What is their track record? And I think very important, the risk for a landowner. Who owns the data and how will it be used? Anson talked about it a little bit. Do you understand all your risks and how can you end this agreement? Can you get out of it if there's a much better deal 2 years down the road? That's important as well, of course. Cool. All right. I'm going to the last part of my presentation, but be aware, it's my sales pitch, so use these criteria for my pitch as well. Cool. So we call it an opportunity to be rewarded for the carbon you store in your soil year after year. Pretty cool. 4 things which are important when I talk about your land, I think. How does it work? What does it pay? What do you have to do? And what are your risks? So this is the scheme. Anson explained it as well. We're a assembler or a broker in between the landowner who stores carbon and the soil carbon storage buyer. And there's a couple of other parties involved. There's a measurement company we use, an independent company. We work with RES, which is the largest ecological service company in the US. They measure the soil carbon. Then there's an independent verification company, and there's an independent certification company organization. So a lot of steps to secure that when the buyer buys a credit, it really represents the carbon storage. Cool. So how does it work? Super simple, in fact. Year one, you take a lot of soil samples. And I think in Anson, your situation were 123 samples cores, 3 feet deep cores, expensive to do. You come back in year 5, and you measure again. So the number here was, let's say, 60 tons per CO2 per acre. And you measure here 75 tons of CO2 per acre. Doesn't require a lot of math skills to determine that you have stored 15. Or in other words, 3 tons of CO2 per acre per year. That's how it works, that's simple. To not make you wait 5 years before you get paid, because that would be kind of risky, the standards we work with also allow a kind of a conservative pre-assessment. And that's based on a couple of factors. And we're still working on that to make that better. So in this case, that will be a ton of CO2 per acre per year, which can be sold on a year-to-year basis. When year 5 comes, you measure, you make up for what you have not sold yet. It's that simple, but it gives you the prepayment. All right, example again, a ranch. You look at the soil maps, the slopes, the different soil types. A sampling plan is being made, and then the team comes in to actually take the 3 feet deep cores using a Giddings unit. The value for soil carbon storage buyers, and that is really important because that determines the price as well. If they trust it a lot, you can get more money from them, so that's important. It's guaranteed atmospheric greenhouse gas reduction. We're not looking at avoided emissions, it's really atmospheric CO2 into your soil we're looking at the increase. Some companies only want to buy that. They don't care about offsets anymore. The other thing is grounded on rigorous measurements. No estimated baseline, it's measured, and it's independently verified and certified, so that'll give you the high quality. The value for landowners. Any landowner can participate. We got rid of all the silly Kyoto rules, where they work with additionality. So if it makes economic sense, you cannot participate. If you're already doing that, you cannot participate. If your neighbors are doing it, you cannot participate. We thought that's ridiculous. That it needs to stop. If you store carbon and it can be measured, you can participate, obviously. Second thing, landowners in control. We're not going to tell you how to manage your property. Who are we? You know your ranch in the best possible way, as long as you do not mess up your soil health by doing silly things. That's the important thing. And then the last thing, a realistic permanence, 10 years. That's kind of the balance a buyer wants to accept. Every year you sell soil carbon, you have to keep your soil health for 10 years intact. Sell again next year, the 10 years move forward with 1 year, and it moves forward that time. 10 years sounds much better than 30 years. So that's what we try to do. Cool. What does it pay? That's important as well. Well, at this point in time, we're at $23 per ton of CO2. That's the target price there as well. There's no out-of-pocket cost to participate. It doesn't cost you a dime. We try to make it easy and hassle-free. We try to have complete transparency. We pay you 80% of the carbon profit, and we take 20% as the broker's fee. What is a carbon profit? That is the $23 minus the direct cost of measurement and certification. So in year 1, when we measure, it's pretty darn expensive. A lot of the $23 will go to measurement, so there's not a heck of a lot of money left for a landowner. Year 2, when you don't measure, there's a lot of money left for a landowner. So what does it look like? A little bit more complicated. A $20 example, so 80% to the landowner after subtraction of these direct costs of measurement and certification. And 20% will go to us. What you get for that, we pay for basically the measurements. There's no out-of-pocket cost. You get also free pasture map you can use because pasture map is one of our products. We're finding the buyers, of course. We take care of all that type of stuff. Cool. A number, just an example here, a 5,000 acre ranch. Soil carbon measurements every 5 years. A situation where you store not a lot of carbon, let's say 0.6 tons of CO2 per acre per year, and when we measure in year 5, 1.2. Year 1, there's actually very little money. There's no money for a landowner because it all goes to measurement cost. Over the total 5-year period, it's about $400,000 that landowner will get. If you move to a situation where there's a ton of CO2 and 2.5 tons, And keep in mind, on the Texas coast, you can easily store 4 tons of CO2 per acre. The total number is already 937. So if you store 4 ton, you're at the double. You're at the $1.8 million over 5 years. Sounds fantastic. We're actually really paying that stuff. You see here a picture of what we're paying 5 Texas ranches actually in the coming few weeks. There are 5 different ranches in different locations, different sizes, so that's why the bars are higher and lower, with different carbon storage estimates. The blue lines is actually what we're paying them now. You see one ranch here is getting a $130,000 check within 2 weeks from now. There's one with about $38,000 and a couple of 25. Next year, so in total that's $212,000 we're paying in the coming 2 weeks. Next year, we estimate that that number will be 490 because the price is already higher, nailed down in the contracts, and there's no measurement cost. So that's the orange bars. So this is just the start. Show you that our estimates are real money, and we're really paying that. Cool. What do you have to do? 4 steps. First, contact us. So we will talk with you and evaluate on a very high level if your land is suitable to participate. This point in time, if you're in areas where there's very little rainfall, it might be hard with these carbon prices to pay for the measurements. So we have to look at it. It depends also on the size of your ranch, how complex is it, on how many samples we need to take. Then review the agreement, ask as many questions as you like, and we have a good FAQ as well. And sign the agreement when you're comfortable. Step 3, we work with Grassroots Carbon to schedule the measurements. You work with Pasture Map to get the properties in the map, to also where the carbon data are being stored. And 4, manage your ranch like you've always done it and probably try to come with improvements. The more you improve, the more you use consultants and help, the more carbon you will store. But of course, way more important is that your ranch profitability, even besides the carbon, will go up. That's it. Pasture Map. We own Pasture Map as our proprietary software. So if you participate, you also get a free Pasture Map subscription. It helps you tremendously with managing your property. We have the specialist, CK is in the back of the room. So contact her, she can help you with that. So that's a good opportunity as well. What are your risks? Just in a nutshell, but be very careful that you understand them. If you store less carbon than estimated and has been sold, there's no out-of-pocket cost for you. We're not going to ask you to pay. We're trying to make that up in the next sales period. If you lost soil carbon due to terrible weather conditions, tremendous droughts or floods or whatever you can think of, no out-of-pocket cost for you. We try to make that up in the next sales. It's kind of our risk. Now, the things you have to be careful about. So if you lose soil carbon because you seriously disturbed your soil health by plowing, tilling, starting to use heavy synthetic or fertilizer, all that type of stuff, that's in the contract. You should not do that. So that's not cool. We make you pay for it, of course. Or you have to make up the cost of soil measurement as well. If you cannot meet the 10-year storage requirements for whatever reason, you also have to make that up. If you want to sell your land and the new owner doesn't take over the contract, you'll also have to make up the payment. But keep in mind that a company has bought your soil carbon storage service for 10 years, basically. So if you violate that and cut 5 years off, you basically didn't fulfill the commitment there. And if you find a better soil carbon deal elsewhere, of course you can always end a contract, but we make you pay for the measurements, because otherwise it would be too silly for us. That's in a nutshell the risks. We try to make it as easy as possible for you, because this whole thing is already pretty complex. We take care of the measurements and the certifications, so you can take care of what you're best at. It's taking care of your land. We're trying to be as transparent as possible as well. We pay you 80% of the carbon profits, period. That's it. You benefit from improvements. So you store more carbon, you get paid more. If the price goes up, you get paid more. And there's no cost to participate. And I think the last one is very important. Freedom. It's your land. You stay in full control. We're not going to tell you what to do. We do not require specific land management practices. Simply, maybe it's not that simple, but maintain soil health. So that's it. We still have a booth. It's not broken down yet, but you can also talk to CK and Nick in the back. We also have a special offer for this conference. You get a year free of Pasture Map irrespective whether you participate in a soil carbon program, yes or no. So that ends within an hour, I think, that deal. So take advantage of it. And just talk to us if you have any questions. That was it.
Great work.
Good job.
I want to change.
Started here with questions. Do I need to bring the microphone to people for
I
questions?
can also repeat the question. Yeah.
Okay. Go ahead, Cara.
I think so, yeah. It will be just your, I'm not a tax, Anson, you're way more familiar with it. But I think it's just normal ranch income. Yeah.
Correct.
Yep.
I'm not a tax attorney. Check with your accountant. But
John?
You talked about taking a 3-foot soil core.
Yep.
What if you don't have 3 feet of soil?
Yeah. we can go as deep as we can. As the drill stops, it stops. So there are in these situations that you have a foot only. Yeah. Yeah, so if it's a foot only, it stops there. Yeah, we try to go 3 feet deep, and that's important because a lot of carbon is actually much deeper in soil than you think it is. So some brokers actually only measure in 15 centimeters, half a foot. And if that first half foot of soil will get saturated with carbon much faster. So if you measure that 5 or 10 years later, oh, I've reached the plateau because it's the same carbon number, because you have not looked deep enough. If you look at the prairie root systems, 6, 9 feet deep, why would you measure this deep? It doesn't make any sense, of course. But it's expensive to do it. Yeah.
Carl?
Depending on the condition of your pasture prairie at the present time, what if that prairie is in very good condition now, and you mentioned a plateau, how does that affect the payment as you go forward in the years?
Yeah, so a good question. So if you have an excellent soil health, an excellent prairie with already a high carbon number, how can you benefit from an increase? We get that question quite often. So you might also say landowners who started to do regenerative grazing 20 years ago and did a fantastic job, are they being punished now? Maybe a little bit. If you really talk to experts like Alan Williams, Richard Teague, Jason Roundtree, they don't believe so much in a plateau. You probably keep storing carbon for a very long time because soil also, and Jeff, you're in the room, you're an expert,
Yeah.
You know way more about this stuff than I.
I've heard Jeff give a good answer to this too.
So you probably build soil up on top, so you probably can store much more carbon. But Jeff, maybe you give the answer.
I think we don't really know enough about saturation in soil organic matter. One of the researchers that's done probably some of the best work in the country is Francesca Catrufo, Colorado State University. She's done some really good work on fractionating organic matter, and so fractionating that organic matter into the particulate associated organic matter and the microbial associated organic matter. What she has found is that mineral associated organic matter will increase to about 10%, and then start to level off. How many of us in here have 10% organic matter in our soils? Not very many of us, right? But what she also found was the particulate organic matter didn't seem to, with 15, I think she was looking at about 15,000 samples. She didn't see a level where that fraction of organic matter started to level off. And so I don't know that we know what our limit is. All I know is that our soils have been depleted historically, and we've got room to make up.
Go ahead.
What about look back on our legacy carbon? I mean, do you all provide anything on that?
Yeah, also.
That's always getting forgotten.
Yeah. The current standards we're working with don't allow a look back, but we're also looking at modifications of a VERA standard, which probably allows a look back of 5 years. Also, the current standard we're working with, we're discussing whether you can look back 5 years, because I think it makes sense. So at this point in time, no, but we're working on it. Because we get that question quite often, of course. Look, what I've done all this work in the past, and why don't I get a reward for it? That's kind of similar maybe to your question as well. Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was curious about catastrophe, thinking about British Columbia and that terrible storm they had that decimated Northwest Washington, coastal areas and all that. How would that be handled? Is there an insurance method to help support farmers and ranchers?
I'll give first the non-expert answer, then Jeff, you take over. So soil carbon is much more resilient than, for instance, forestry. What we even know from studies from Rice University on the Texas coast, when the ocean comes in with a hurricane, salt water, that a few months later, everything looks perfect again. Soil carbon is incredibly resilient. It's fire resistant, it doesn't matter. Very different than a forest, of course. So we're not too concerned. If you have drought, you will store less carbon, of course. It doesn't mean that you will lose carbon immediately. That will take probably much longer time. But Jeff, your
I would just, very good answer. I would say that when we look at soil organic matter over time, it's not this static linear plane. It's doing this every day, right? And it's changing every day. We just don't have the technology to measure it every day, right? And so, but annually, the climate west of the 100th meridian can have as much impact on the rate of sequestration than our management oftentimes. And so in years of drought, and he mentioned that, they have a metric. If there's a flood or a serious drought or a reason that particular year, on your 5th year, they have ways of mitigating some of those things. But when you begin to compare soil organic carbon in grassland systems versus forest systems, 5% of our carbon in that system is underground versus in a forested system where most of it is up and can be burned or cut off.
I have a question for Anson, and it's something that you mentioned, and I know the answer to it, but I think this crowd might be interested in it. You mentioned it cost you $90 an acre to get your ranch up and running to regeneratively graze. Why don't you touch on how you paid for that, how you got that done?
I paid for it because I set money aside and invested in the market. I'm planning on paying it back to myself, and the way I justified that was running the numbers versus, okay, if I keep that money in the market versus, at a conservative 8% return versus, investing in the ranch, that if you invested in the ranch based on and at that time soil carbon, we hadn't even talked to grassroots, but just based on the fact that over time we should be able to increase our stock density, and the changes that made into our management, that when we round up that 1,800 acre pasture, that instead of it being 1,800 acres and needing to hire extra hands, that we'd have a 40 acre paddock and one guy can move it. All those sort of factors that go into it, is it basically it lowered our costs enough and increased our revenue enough that it would pay for itself over time. That's it, but it also, in the back of my mind, I knew that there was going to be this opportunity for some sort of ecosystem services payment, and whereas soil carbon storage is the one that's paying right now. We've obviously the head springs of the river. I've had conversations with different groups about, okay, how do we measure the increased amount of water capture and spring recharge, getting paid for that. We've been able to increase our hunting lease price, and then also NRCS Conservation Stewardship Program, we're eligible for that as a result. So I took the approach and a leap of, really I was going to do this regardless at the end of the day, because aside from being a Marine and a father and a husband, going out and seeing the grasslands come back is the most fulfilling thing that I've ever done. And I go out after it doesn't matter what's going on in the week at work, and you see one new grass plant coming up that wasn't there before, that does it for me. So I really can't put a value on that. But the approach I took was build it and it'll come. And so we built it, and so far it's been coming.
Thanks for getting to that about that CSP and using some of those dollars as well to get some of your infrastructure in. Kara?
Questions. Is there a minimum acreage that y'all are asking, and then per core, or maybe it's not just core, but what's the average amount spent, say, on one horse?
Yeah, cool. Yeah. So minimum acreage. The answer is it depends. It depends a little bit on the complexity of your property. If there's a lot of different strata, different soil types, different slopes, different ecosystem, different management systems you're using, we need to take more cores. So if there's more uniformity in a ranch, you have less cores, so it becomes cheaper. So ballpark, it also depends where you are, of course, with rainfall. So if you're in areas where there's more carbon storage, it's okay, you can afford more cores. So 1,000 acres, maybe kind of a ballpark, but it depends. Larger can be, of course, cheaper. There's maybe an alternative. If there's a couple of smaller ranches in a similar area, not too far from each other, you can do maybe a sampling plan over a larger region, but only sample in the ranches. So that might be a cost advantage. So we're looking into that, how you can do that. So that depends as well. If the carbon price goes up, you can also afford more money for measurement. So things will get better there. Yeah. And your second question, what is the cost per, at this point in time, it's something like $10 per acre, but that's very much an average. We've worked with a couple of very small ranches where the number was much higher. We went closer to $50 per acre, so that's not affordable. And we went to a couple of larger ranches where the cost is a little bit lower. So how we do it with our payment to landowners, how you get an economic sheet, which really your amount of cores, your amount of carbon storage, what the cost was for your ranch. So if you have a large ranch with low complexity, you get more money paid than someone with a very complex ranch, and that makes sense. Yeah.
John?
So at the end of the 5 years, don't you have to go through that same intensive sampling to determine?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So you have that cost, you have another $9 per acre, $7.
Yeah, absolutely. In year 5, you do the same sampling procedure again. The good news is that we're almost sure that the carbon price is higher at that point in time, year 5 from now. So the pain of the sampling cost is just much lower. But yes, you have to do the same thing. And then the next 5 years, you do the similar thing, and again and again and again. Over time, measurement costs will also go down. There will be more scale, there will be more suppliers, there will be better technology. As we learn, we can probably start putting in remote sensing opportunities over time. So what we also will do in Grassroots Carbon is to make the data open source without giving away the protection for your data privacy. So we're working on that, because these data are incredibly important for scientists to develop new models, develop novel methods to measure your soil carbon. So we want to make that available to actually help all of us. Yeah.
And so at the end of 5 years, let's say you want to stop the contract.
Mm-hmm.
But you got 10 more years that you have to store the carbon.
Yeah.
And that's going to be monitored over those 10 years, and you have to pay those costs.
Not on the years, yes. So basically what a buyer buys from you is a 10-year storage. So there will be some audits. You might be, maybe there might be a satellite picture being checked sometimes, that you don't sell your property to become a parking lot for a shopping mall. That would not be good. So there will be some auditing. Yeah, but very light. Yeah.
There's a question in the back there.
So I realize this is a grazing land conference, but what about cropland? Is there a place for cropland carbon credits?
Yeah. Is there an opportunity for croplands? Absolutely. We're not focusing at croplands at this point in time, because a huge chunk of the United States, I think over 40 or 45% is basically grazing land. So there's enough service area there. There's a couple of other brokers who specialize at croplands. Absolutely. It's simpler. It's easier to measure. The measurement costs are lower. So yes, you can do cropland as well. Absolutely. Yes.
Carl?
So if we had a 5-year contract, which we were talking to, and we had to ensure that ground kept intact for
Yeah.
another 10.
Yeah.
When that 5 years expires, we get signed up with another company for the next 5.
Yes, you can. Yeah, but you still have to maintain your soil health for 10 years. Absolutely. Yeah.
And if you had something that guaranteed permanence in that prairie condition, say a conservation easement,
Yeah.
that offer more value to your.
Absolutely. Yeah. Conservation easements is a form of guaranteeing your soil health there. Absolutely. Yeah. That is valuable. You had a question, Bill?
Yeah, I was just thinking about your last statement about the amount of grazing land. What about all the public grazing land?
Yeah.
I mean, I think it'd be kind of interesting if these companies are paying the government to store carbon on public grazing land.
Yeah, but why not? So,
Pay the landowner, let the leasee, not the landowner.
yeah.
Yeah.
That's
Of course, a lot of that public land
Ensign,
is also very arid and probably less suitable
Yeah.
for this than a lot of the private land.
Ensign, any views there? You're the lawyer.
Yes. So, the most similar thing, I represent a number of landowners or not landowners, the grazing lessee for these contracts, and they brought it to the landowner. And what they negotiate with the landowner was dependent on that negotiation process. But really what we came to is, okay, great landowner, go find another grazing lessee that's going to practice this regenerative grazing in your county. You're not going to find one. So pretty much it was what we worked out is if the landowner expended funds putting in the regenerative grazing system, the waters, the fencing, then the landowner would recoup those funds. But other than that, the payment went to the grazing lessee because they're the ones that are having to make the daily moves and the investment. But for them, it wouldn't have been possible.
Bill and then John.
So I got a question now. Kind of hesitant to ask it, but I'm gonna ask it anyway. What happens if the government does get involved on the public land side? Is that something that you're?
Yeah, so absolutely. Of course, the U.S. Department of Agriculture is also looking at a Climate Solution Act. That might take quite a while before that comes on board. So that's why we're very careful to use very robust science-based data points. And also the standard we're working with, if that standard would be excluded from such a government program, then there's no program at all. So we try to work with super high quality data and not just some shortcuts where you use just some model or just a satellite image. That might come over time. It's not the time yet because we don't understand these systems enough yet. So we believe in robust data. They're expensive, but that will give us a fantastic foundation. So I'm less worried about it. Yeah.
John, did you have a question?
Is there a minimum precipitation you think that below that is really not worth doing contracts?
Yeah. So is there a minimum precipitation? The question is also depends a little bit. It depends also how complex is your land. If you're maybe in an area in West Texas where there's a huge uniformity in a very large range, let's assume you have 25,000 acres, and you have to take less sampling points, that might be okay. It might also be that we work with another certification agency where you look at 10-year projects or 20-year projects. When it might become more affordable, you can think of a different model that you're not being paid on a year-to-year basis, but in a different system. So we're all exploring that. So there might be different flavors for different landowners. Yeah.
Anson, what's your annual precip at Head of the River Ranch?
Average 21, but we all know there's no such thing as an average.
Yeah.
Correct. Go ahead.
If you have a conservation easement on your property, you're not able to, sell your mineral rights and that kind of thing, does this fall into that, or is this one of those things that hasn't been considered yet?
Sorry. So did you say if you can't sell your carbon because of your?
If you are under a conservation easement, you're not supposed to be selling your mineral rights, would this fall into that, or is this like this uncharted territory for?
I think it's uncharted, huh?
And I wouldn't say that that's a great question, but since it's soil carbon storage, and you're not actually exporting anything, I would not certainly say this doesn't in any way fall under oil and gas development. I have yet to see a conservation easement that precluded the entering into a contract like this. That would most times be outside the scope of a conservation easement. And especially, the conservation easement, as he said, really complements what they're trying to, if anything, it's a huge boost because instead of the potential that, all right, cool, I'm out of this contract in 15 years, I'm going to go turn it into a subdivision. No, if conservation easements for perpetuity, which gives the purchaser these purchasers can really get a black eye if 15 years from now somewhere where they bought this carbon storage gets developed, whereas if it's perpetual, they never have that concern.
We're at the end of the road here for questions and in this session to be filmed and whatnot, but I'm sure that the speakers will still be here and be ready, willing to entertain more questions. So, round of applause for these guys. Thanks. A lot of information.